On February 28, 2026, a joint series of strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran resulted in the death of the supreme leader, igniting a geopolitical crisis that had been simmering for years. In the subsequent 48 hours, maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz plummeted by 70%. Effectively, the planet's most vital energy conduit is now shut down. While politicians spent the last year celebrating declining inflation, that statistical illusion has been destroyed by the disruption of a $500 billion daily supply chain, one for which Washington has no contingency plan. Today, we will delve into the raw data behind the strait's closure, detail precisely how this energy shock is set to rekindle inflation, and explain why the Federal Reserve is now operating without a clear path forward. To grasp the immense scale of this event, one must first appreciate why a small channel of water in the Persian Gulf holds the power to throw the entire global economy into cardiac arrest. Consider the Strait of Hormuz the aorta of the global industrial engine. Every day, roughly 20 million barrels of oil pass through this corridor, accounting for 20% of all petroleum liquids consumed worldwide. This represents over a quarter of all seaborne oil trade, all funneling through a shipping lane merely 33 kilometers wide. You might be thinking that the U.S. is now energy independent, with record domestic production reaching 13.6 million barrels per day. Why should an individual in Kansas or Ohio be concerned about a choke point on the other side of the world? This is the exact narrative being promoted by the mainstream media, and it demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how global commodity markets function. Oil is priced on a global scale. When you refuel your car at a gas station in Ohio, you aren't paying for Ohio-sourced crude, you're paying the global spot price for the commodity. When 20 million barrels per day are removed from the global financial system, that spot price surges everywhere at once, irrespective of where a local refinery gets its crude oil. There's no protective shield from domestic production and no special exception for America. As Clayton Allen at the Center for Strategic and International Relations stated, since oil is a global fungible commodity, a disruption anywhere affects prices everywhere. The disruption we are currently witnessing is larger than anything seen in recent memory. The 1973 Arab oil embargo took approximately 4 million barrels per day off the global market. This caused prices to quadruple, sparked the most severe recession since the Great Depression, and fundamentally altered the global perspective on energy security. The closure of Hormuz jeopardizes 20 million barrels per day. To provide some context, the present crisis is nearly 5 times the magnitude of the most severe energy shock in modern history. This is why Saul Kavanik at MST Marquee describes it as potentially 3 times more severe than the 1970s oil embargo and the Iranian Revolution combined. Similarly, Bob McNally at Rapidan Energy Group plainly stated, a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz is a guaranteed global recession. Before we examine the Federal Reserve's untenable situation, we need to address your financial security. Geopolitical shocks of this nature have a track record of decimating portfolios that are based on obsolete assumptions. The opportunity to reposition your assets correctly is always shorter than most people realize. This is precisely why you should consider subscribing to the Free Coin Bureau Finance Weekly newsletter. Each week, we analyze the macroeconomic data that the mainstream media overlooks, offering you actionable insights into what global developments like this truly mean for your investments. You can subscribe immediately by clicking the link in the description or scanning the QR code on your screen. It's completely free, but in a market operating on outdated beliefs, it could be invaluable. Now, returning to the analysis, here is the detail most experts are overlooking in the current crisis. The Strait of Hormuz is not being physically obstructed by Iranian warships in a dramatic naval standoff. Instead, the closure is being enforced by insurance underwriters in London. Following the U.S. and Israeli attacks on February 28, war risk insurers gave 48 to 72-hour cancellation notices to vessels scheduled to pass through the Gulf. Marsh, the world's leading insurance broker, projects immediate rate hikes of 25% to 50% for any vessel that tries to navigate the strait. Prior to this crisis, the war risk premium for a Hormuz transit was about 0.25% of a vessel's insured hull value. For a $150 million container ship, this amounted to around $375,000 for one trip. Post-crisis, these premiums have instantly doubled to 0.5% or higher, translating to $750,000 per transit, costs that are passed on to cargo owners as a war risk surcharge. CMA-CGM has already implemented an emergency conflict surcharge of $2,000 per 20-foot container. Hapag-Lloyd, MSC, and Maersk have halted all transits. This highlights the underlying mechanism. It's not a naval blockade but an insurance boycott, and the impact on cargo movement is the same. Currently, about 150 tankers are anchored in Gulf waters. 14 liquefied natural gas, LNG, carriers have either slowed or stopped near the strait. Approximately 170 container ships, carrying 450,000 shipping containers, are now stranded inside the Persian Gulf with no way out. While the waterway isn't officially closed, for every commercial entity that matters it is. For the countries whose economies are directly dependent on Gulf energy, this is an immediate crisis. Saudi Arabia ships 5 million barrels per day through the strait, which is 38% of Hormuz's total crude oil traffic. Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar have no alternative export routes. Saudi Arabia and the UAE possess bypass pipelines with a total capacity of roughly 5 million barrels per day. Compared to the 20 million barrels that transit Hormuz daily, this only accounts for, at best, 27% of the daily volume. The remaining 14 million barrels per day are physically stuck. That's right, 14 million barrels daily have no bypass, no alternative pipeline, and no other route to take. The situation for natural gas is arguably even more dire. Qatar alone exports around 9.3 billion cubic feet of LNG per day through the strait, and Qatar Energy has now stopped all production. As a consequence, European natural gas futures surged by over 40% on Monday morning. Europe, having substituted Russian pipeline gas with Qatari LNG after 2022, now faces its second energy supply crisis in just 4 years. Let's discuss how this will affect your cost of living. The way an oil shock translates to higher grocery bills is quicker and more severe than many assume. As of January 2026, core producer prices in the U.S. were already elevated. The Core Producer Price Index, PPI, registered at 3.6% year-over-year, its highest level in 10 months and more than twice what many analysts had predicted on a monthly basis. This data was released before the current crisis disrupted a single barrel of oil. Producers were already contending with rising cost pressures from tariffs and supply chain issues. On top of this, we are now about to inflict a 10% oil price shock on an already fragile system. This is how the mechanism works. Energy costs are integrated into the price of every item that is transported, manufactured, and packaged. Diesel fuel constitutes 37% of total operating costs for U.S. trucking. The moment diesel prices spike, freight surcharges are adjusted weekly based on the Department of Energy's benchmarks. These increased freight costs are then borne by retailers. Facing a structural hit to their profit margins, retailers ultimately pass these expenses on to consumers. Every $10 rise in the price of oil adds approximately 0.2% to headline consumer prices. Brent crude increased by more than $6 in just 48 hours, and analysts at Barclays, UBS, and Wood Mackenzie are all projecting a trajectory toward $100 per barrel or more if the disruptions continue. That's a potential $30 price jump from recent levels. It doesn't require complex math to understand that this will be felt at the grocery store. The American consumer is completely unprepared to handle this. As we discussed in our last analysis of the overextended consumer, Americans now hold $1.28 trillion in credit card debt, a record high since the New York Fed started tracking this data in 1999. The average interest rate on that debt exceeds 22%. Over half of all credit card users are now using their cards for essential expenses such as food, fuel, and healthcare. Since January 2020, grocery store food prices have increased by a cumulative 30%. Beef prices rose 15% year-over-year in January's data alone, and coffee prices are climbing at a rate of nearly 4.5% annually. These were the existing vulnerabilities before the oil shock hit. Essentially, the average U.S. consumer was already financially strained. Now, a structural increase in energy costs will be layered on top of all the financial pressures they are already enduring. This leads to what economists term a stagflationary environment, slowing economic growth combined with rising prices. This is not a hypothetical scenario. Economists at RBC, RSM, and Apollo Global Management were already using the term stagflation light to describe the U.S. economy before any military action took place. GDP growth in Q4 2025 was a modest 1.4% annualized. Core PCE was already at 3%, significantly above the Fed's 2% target. The oil shock isn't creating a new issue, it is drastically worsening one that was already in progress. This leads us to the harsh reality of the situation. The Federal Reserve is now ensnared in one of the most severe policy dilemmas in its history. To appreciate the danger of this predicament, we must look back to 1973. When the Arab oil embargo occurred, the Federal Reserve was under the leadership of Chairman Arthur Burns. Burns viewed the escalating energy prices as a temporary, supply-side shock that was beyond the influence of monetary policy. Consequently, the Fed maintained very accommodative monetary conditions, continuing its expansionary stance even as inflation was picking up speed. By 1973, annual inflation reached 12%. By 1979, following the second oil shock from the Iranian Revolution, inflation peaked at 15%. Burns was essentially following the same strategy the Fed would later adopt during the COVID era, labeling a supply-driven price shock as transitory, and avoiding tightening policy due to a fragile underlying economy. This led to a lost decade for the purchasing power of Americans. It wasn't until Paul Volcker took charge in 1979 and increased the federal funds rate to an astounding 20% that the inflationary cycle was finally broken, but this came at the expense of 2 consecutive recessions and the loss of nearly 4 million jobs. Does this sound familiar? Now consider the Federal Reserve's current predicament. The Fed funds rate is between 3.5% and 3. Core PCE stands at 3% and is climbing. Core PPI just came in at 3. And oil is now climbing toward $100 a barrel due to a supply shock that the Fed cannot control. If the Fed lowers rates to shield the economy from a downturn, and there is significant pressure to do so, it risks allowing this oil-driven inflation to become entrenched in the broader economy, thereby repeating Arthur Burns's mistake from 1974. However, if the Fed keeps rates elevated or increases them to combat the oil shock, it would devastate the commercial real estate market, tighten financial conditions in a slowing economy, and possibly trigger the recession it has been trying to prevent. The Fed cannot create oil. It cannot reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And it cannot simultaneously combat inflation and foster growth when the inflation is caused by a geopolitical event that has no monetary solution. They are, quite literally, flying blind, and the market is aware of it. Traders are now indicating a 94% chance of no rate cut at the March 17 meeting. The likelihood of a cut in June has already plummeted. The shutdown of the world's most essential energy channel is not just a regional geopolitical dispute between 2 nations with a history of conflict. It represents a systemic shock to the foundation of the global economy. By cutting off 20 million barrels of daily supply, this crisis ensures that inflation will return to an economy that had not yet fully suppressed it. It puts central banks in an impossible situation, caught between controlling price hikes and averting a financial meltdown. And it guarantees that the cost of living for the average consumer, already burdened by record credit card debt and a 30% cumulative increase in food prices since 2020, is about to become substantially higher. The illusion that inflation was defeated is now over. The economic data was already signaling problems before the conflict even began. Now, the The economic reality is poised to align with what millions of household budgets have been indicating for some time. But I'm interested in your opinion. Do you believe this oil shock will compel the Fed to raise interest rates again? Or will they disregard the inflation threat and cut rates to prop up the stock market? Please share your perspective in the comments section. As always, thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.